Howdy, folks. It's me, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you the extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war. Here I am, rocking in a free world, and by rocking, I mean talking about things I want to talk about in the free world, and in this case, that is the Ukraine War. And if you want to come and join me, then that's awesome. Where are we going to start? We're going to start with Evil Girkin or Igor Strelkov, who is actually, as I was reminded today, an indicted terrorist. He's been done for blowing up the M17 jet, MH17, sorry, jet that was taken down some years back, and he was indeed found guilty by proxy. So here he is as a military blogger in his other job. So he moonlights as a terrorist. He was, of course, the former military leader in the Donbas with the little green men of the Russian forces that were basically sent in for an illegal war from 2014 onwards. Here he's getting quite melancholic and he's pretty down about what is going on in the war. Now, this is at a time when Bakhmut is likely to fall. It's likely to fall to the Russians fairly soon, one would assume, bar a particular daring counterattack, I would think. But it's really not that significant if Bakhmut was to be lost. I know this is where pro-Russian voices go, oh, listen to the cope, listen, and all this kind of nonsense, as if like this is some way of trying to find the silver lining to the cloud. But I must remind you that this is the map of Ukraine. This is what Putin wanted for his own little backyard. And that there, somewhere there, is so small I can't even see, is Bakhmut. Little dot on the map there. It has some localized tactical kind of operational significance. I mean, you can't take the Donbass if you don't take Bakhmut. You know, that's a truism. It's obvious because it's part of the Donbass. And it will give you further access to taking or advancing on Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, perhaps even Siversk as well, maybe Tourette's. But other than that, it's just a small town in the east of Ukraine. It might well fall, but it's not all that in a bag of chips. Now, Igor Girkin here kind of is pretty down on what's going on in the east and on the front lines as a whole. He's pretty negative. Then partway down here, he says problems with ammunition and simply the production of the most conventional weapons in the Russian Federation are also increasing every day. And against the backdrop of all this, the irremovable marshals continue to beat their foreheads, not their own, unfortunately, against the enemy's prepared defenses in the Donbass, with extremely insignificant successes and more often without any success, but with heavy losses. There is no martial law and is not expected based on the statements of a person who outwardly resembles the president. Oh, he is being really critical here. And that normally he doesn't quite go for the juggler in terms of the president, but now he seems to be really skating on thin ice. The borders are open, oil and gas are flowing to partners, including Kiev. The central bank of the Russian Federation is increasing investments in US government bonds. And the only entertainment for angry patriots dumbfounded by reality is a public mutual scuffle paid for by gentlemen Shoigu and Prigozhin, which is ugly as it is, and testifying both to how rotten everything is in our country, but also to the fact that in the military leadership, unity of command. And who of the two indicated persons is more right, you should decide for yourself if you wish. As for me, it's better to avoid sorting out two sorts of crap. Oof. That is painful. So he's not happy. He is not happy at all. That 3-day war, a 3-day special military operation is now biting. All right, let's move to something utterly unconnected. Well, marginally unconnected. This is training on tanks, and I'm going to show you 3 little videos of tank simulators. So Ukrainian simulators for T-64 tanks here. So pre-war Ukraine had around 850 T-64 tanks, mostly upgraded T-64BV and a 2017 model. The T-64 acts as one of the main battle tanks for Ukraine. It's estimated that between 300 and 400 of these were damaged, destroyed, or captured during the war. And here you have, in the background, these simulators, so you don't have to actually go out in the tanks, and that's helping these guys learn how to drive and operate these big hunks of metal, um, and someone else checking out that they're doing the right thing, or indeed training on other parts there. So that is one indication of training taking place. Now let's move to another video. This is a German Leopard 2 tank simulator. Ukrainian tankers are currently training on these. As you can see. And this tank is pretty much driving on a mound at something of an angle. So that's another tank simulator. And then we're going to go to a third tank simulator, which I believe is also uh, the Leopard 2. So these are instructors of the Canadian Armed Forces and Polish Armed Forces training Ukrainian soldiers on Leopard tanks. And let's have a look at what's going on here. Very stirring music, which will take off. So this looks like a more considerable piece of simulator kit. So there you go. Lots of training taking place. Actually, we've seen images from that piece of video there previously, and that's Canada taking a bow for what they are doing to help the Ukrainians get up to speed on using the Leopard 2, and they are indeed providing some Leopard 2s as well. I'm just going to take you along to this is Timothy Snyder. Timothy Snyder is a historian. This video interview for PBS Frontline is phenomenally good. It is really very good. You should all go and watch it. Full stop. I'm going to just excerpt these three couple of little segments at the beginning, and then I'm going to excerpt further parts in future videos just because it's worth it. You just got to watch it. Hopefully PBS don't mind me doing this because I'm actually bigging up this PBS video as being superb, and that you should all go and watch it.
So this is really a profound moment for the
Oops.
Biden administration, one that's going to define who they are and really define his presidency.
I think in 100 years, historians will be writing about the war in Ukraine. I'm not sure there's going to be any other event in the Biden administration about which that is true. A lot of the things that seem very important to us right now, like gas prices one summer or whether we're wearing masks or not, that's going to disappear into the mists of time. Whether Ukraine wins or loses, which is very much up to the United States, very much up to the Biden administration, is something that historians are going to be writing about in 100 years.
That is, I've literally got shivers up my spine there. That is absolutely on the money. The other day, there was some kickback with why is Biden in Kyiv and not in Ohio, talking about the train in East Palestine that was derailed, right? And you can argue about train regulation. In fact, previous administration did some deregulation or tries to blame the Biden administration, but actually, you could argue as a result of stuff that's happened previously. Anyway, does that really matter? Will that matter in 100 years' time? 100 years' time, are they going to be talking about that? So Biden's been slagged off for not going back to there by some people, slagged off for not going to look at the southern border in the US, which is an ongoing issue. And I'm not saying that's not important, but what I am saying is what Schneider is saying here, which is that the war in Ukraine is of utmost importance. And if Biden is the leader of the free world, if he's one of the most important leaders in the world, if you as an American think that you are a super important country, then you should be imagining that Biden needs to be representing you and the power structures that the US is involved in Kyiv, in trying to sort out this war. This war will have so many books being written about it. In fact, there are books being written about it right now. This is hugely important, and history will be on the side of Biden, I think, and the US administration and all the countries that are getting involved for doing so.
There's this tremendous effort to try to dissuade Vladimir Putin. There's a video call, there's statements that Biden makes, there's diplomatic missions going to Moscow trying to convince them, there are warnings, there are threats. Why does it not dissuade Vladimir Putin from invading?
I believe that Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine on the basis of a systematically false understanding of what Russia is and what Ukraine is. Putin helps us understand him by publishing a 7,000-word essay about his own views about history. And in that essay, he makes it clear that he doesn't really believe that Ukraine has any kind of independent existence. There isn't really a Ukrainian state. There isn't really a Ukrainian nation.
He goes on actually to talk about how Putin evidences that belief back in the Bush administration, talking, years before. In fact, this is a long-running kind of belief of his. It's interesting. I'm listening to the book The Gates of Europe, is it? Which is historical account of, well, it's a history of Ukraine, and actually those kind of ideas during the kind of rise of the Bolshevik movement that were going around during the early part of the 20th century, and at the time where there's quite a lot of nationalistic politics going on in both Russia and Ukraine, and there were times when the Ukrainian language was kind of outlawed, Ukrainian books were outlawed, and so on and so forth. It seems like, history is repeating itself, or at least, rhyming to some extent.
You're planning your war on that basis, you think it's going to be all over before anybody else's response really matters. The Russians were planning for a 3-day war. They were planning for a political war. They were thinking that there aren't really that many Ukrainians in the sense of people who'd be willing to risk their lives for their country.
Exactly what I've been saying for a long time, and of course many people have.
And in this, they were entirely wrong. I think what Putin was imagining is that this is all going to be over so quickly that anybody else's reactions, be they sanctions, be anything else, are going to look silly and aren't really going to matter.
When he announces what he calls special military operation, but which is the war in Ukraine, if you go back and you look at that speech, one of the things that's interesting about it, the line that comes out of it is the empire of lies. And a lot of the speech is about the United States. It's about Ukraine, but a lot of it is about the United States in particular. What do you make when you see him deliver that speech?
This is a really interesting answer. Pay attention to this. It's very good, very salient point.
Well, Putin is, and he isn't talking about America. I mean, this is not a man who really spends a lot of time in the rest of the world. Unlike a lot of the foreign leaders with which he deals, he doesn't know foreign languages. He doesn't know a thing about Ukraine, which is interesting. He thinks he knows everything. He doesn't know anything. And his understanding of Ukraine is based on the notion that it isn't really a place. And if it seems to be a place, this is because of foreign conspiracies. And then in historical reasoning, those conspiracies have been in the past the Austrians, the Germans, the Poles, the Jews. Today it's the European Union and the Americans. So Putin's worldview, which I think he really believes, is that Moscow and Kiev are somehow organically together and always should be. And it's only because of the outsiders that this isn't true. And so what he's talking about is not America as it is. He's talking about a fantasy of America that wants to do these insidious things like take Ukraine away from Russia. But that just shows, in my view anyway, a misunderstanding not only of America and Ukraine, but also of his own country.
Sorry, the bit I was thinking that was going to be, is this the next part, which follows on from what he's just said.
Before Ukraine, many Americans didn't see themselves in a Cold War with Russia, didn't see Russia necessarily as a major enemy, but here he's describing America as a major enemy. How important is it to understand the different worldviews of Americans and of Russians about what's happening and how different they are?
Well, the one thing that one has to understand is that the Russians are systematically wrong about how much attention Americans pay to Russia. The Russians think about America all the time. Americans only think about Russia when they have to.
That was a bit that I thought was absolutely fascinating. So Russia are obsessed with America, and had been for a long time, and America had been obsessed to some degree during the height of the Cold War, maybe with Russia, but it's not in the minds of Americans, or hasn't been in the minds of Americans in the same way obsessively as it has been with Russians, especially when you look at the cultural differences and how Russia have probably looked to America and the freedom and the commercialism and materialism, all this kind of stuff that for some decades, those who knew about it, I mean, there's a lot of misinformation that went around, would have been like obsessing about America for those reasons, as well as kind of ideological reasons, so on. So there's a lot of obsession with America, I imagine. This is, and I think, like intuitively, it sounds really plausible, and where that same obsession isn't reciprocated.
And that is not a reality which Russian leaders can afford to recognize or talk about, because their power or their ideology of power rests on the idea that there are great powers in the world: Russia, America, China. Russia's one of these great powers. And so the basic reality that Americans actually don't really like to think about Russia, they don't think about Russia that much, it would be something which is absolutely unacceptable. But that's a fundamental difference in worldview. Russian leaders are thinking about not thinking about domestic politics, thinking about foreign policy all the time, and foreign policy is a kind of duel of great powers. American presidents, American public opinion, the American columnists, they're not thinking that way. We only react to Russia when we absolutely have to.
It's really interesting when you think about American news. Traditionally, over the decades, America's such a big country, right? And I know Russia's a geographically big country, but I think America has so many states, and it's so. I mean, the population is now bigger in. It wasn't always the case, but it's now quite a bit bigger in the US than it is in Russia. But news, therefore, is very domestically orientated, and there isn't this interest in foreign, or at least historically, there has been. I think in the internet age, things might be changing, but America looks in, but also sees itself as a big player on the world stage, but is on a day-to-day basis is quite obsessed with what's going on inside. You know, you only have to look at the news for that. Whereas Russia, I imagine, is very much obsessed with what's going on out there. In fact, it was interesting when Putin did his big speech just recently, an hour and 45-minute speech, and an hour and 10 minutes of it was on domestic policy. And some of the analysts were saying he never talks about domestic policy. It's always about sort of foreign. That doesn't interest him. It's always about power plays, foreign policy. You know, he is interested in the chess game that is geopolitics, and where and very many people, it appears, in Russia are, you know, worried about or concerned about America and things out there. Maybe it's because it distracts them from actually how crap things might be for many of them, or at least historically have been, um, domestically. So I don't know. I find it really interesting.
I mean, we reacted very, very late and very, very weak to the Russian intervention in the American election in 2016. When Mitt Romney said, when he was campaigning against Barack Obama, that Russia was a serious threat, everyone laughed at him, except the Russians, who would kind of like to think that they were a serious threat. When Obama says that Russia doesn't matter because it's only a regional economy and so on, he's saying something which to the Russians is absolutely incomprehensible. They think of themselves as a great power and they want to prove that they're a great power. So the biggest difference is that Russians really like to think about America because American enmity, the idea that America is trying to hurt Russia, gives Russia a sense of meaning, whereas Americans absolutely do not need Russia for their sense of themselves. That's the basic difference.
That is so important. I mean, that, wow, he's just summed that up in a couple of concise sentences. It's almost pithy, and yet it's just spot on. I think that's so worth listening to that again. That little,
Incomprehensible. They think of themselves as a great power and they want to prove that they're a great power. So the biggest difference is that Russians really like to think about America because American enmity, the idea that America is trying to hurt Russia, gives Russia a sense of meaning, whereas Americans absolutely do not need Russia for their sense of themselves. That's the basic difference.
America doesn't need Russia for its sense of self, but Russia needs America for its sense of self. Its sense of self is almost in this battle with others and trying to denigrate others. There was, I don't know if it's in this chat or it might have been somewhere. I've watched so much stuff and listened to so much stuff recently, but it's about, for Russia, their success isn't about presenting something positive, but it's about making something negative about others. It's about seeing yourself in comparison to other nations. And if you can undermine them, make them look crap, get involved in their elections and say, look, their democracies are crap and rubbish and falling to bits and it's corrupt, right? Then you don't need to say anything about yourself because obviously all those problems exist there, but you sell your own people the narrative that they're not, and you point out the rubbishness over there. It's all about pointing out the crapness of everyone else rather than talking about the wonderfulness of what you've created. There's no creativity in Russian kind of politics and in kind of Russian, I sense, psyche. I don't know. I might be misspeaking it, but it might be later on in this interview. Somewhere in the last couple of days, there's a big thing about this kind of difference in creativity um, and positivity versus negativity in others. That I think sounds very intuitively plausible to me. Here's a little. I will go back to that interview and I'll exit other parts because it is that good. Jeffrey Sachs is great power politics. So Jeffrey Sachs is an economist who, right from the beginning of the war, in fact, when I wrote an article back in April last year, February last year, beginning of the war. As soon as the war happened, I was like, "Is this war so clear cut?" I was like trying to balance both sides and look at really what was responsible for the war happening. And Jeffrey Sachs was a voice that came on, and they had him on Radio 4 in the morning in the UK, and he was presenting the idea that it's NATO's fault, that it's expansionism, and really kind of giving that Russian narrative early doors. And in fact, he's just been on Unheard recently, saying that it was definitely the US that blew up the Nord Stream 2 and giving all those talking points. I'm like 50-50. I'm not, probably 55-45 about who did that. But it's really interesting that he's like full tilt into like the US he's fully behind like the Russian narrative, it seems. I mean, there are some good points amongst what he says, of course. It's not so simplistic as fully black and white. But where I think it is interesting with someone like him, so this is an interview that I'm sure you get a lot out of if you read it, New Yorker interview. And he what I find interesting. So the Economist discusses what the US gets wrong about Putin and the war in Ukraine, right? And this interviewer, who is it? Not Lev Red, Isaac Chotiner is good, and he's sort of angling a little bit, and goes in a bit for the not for the jugular at the end, but some interesting questions. So you have all of this stuff going down, all the usual kind of ins and outs, and giving the narratives and whatnot. And then towards the end of the interview, the interviewer is pretty on point here. He says, "Okay, let's move on to your meeting with Viktor Orban." So Viktor Orban, to remind you, is the autocratic leader of Hungary that has been siding with Russia, is a Putin wannabe. And inside Hungary, there's been a democratic backsliding where Orban has removed the democratic institutions or checks and balances, put in his own sort of judges in the judiciary, has shut down the free press, all this kind of stuff. So Orban is Putin number two. And isn't it interesting that here we have someone who's kind of presenting the other side of the story, but also, as in that the US is at fault and NATO's at fault, etc., etc. But also, is meeting with Viktor Orban. What's going on there? So this interviewer says, "Okay, let's move on to your meeting with Viktor Orban. A happier subject. What did you guys discuss?" Just a one very short answer. "We discussed the Ukraine war." "Why did you go see him?" "I was invited to the National Bank of Hungary to give a talk." And that's interesting why he'll be invited there. "And I paid a courtesy call on the president." The interviewer says, "As one does." Yeah, because of course, when I go and give a talk, I mean, I give philosophical talks, right? Or I used to when I was more mobile, and I go to places to give a talk on philosophy, and then of course I just go and meet the local MP, of course, every time. Or if I give a talk in London, I'm sure I'd meet the king, right? I mean, that's what you do. What do you so as one does? And he says, "Well, you do," says Jeffrey Sachs, if you've known him since 1989. Yes. Okay. So what do you make of his current rule? And this is the question. So this is like the interviewer saying, okay, what's good about Orban? What do you like about him? What do you think about his rule? There's democratic backsliding here. We are reporting on how Hungary is a real problem. You're going to meet him, paying him a courtesy call. What do you think about his rule? Let me know. What do you think about his rule? We discussed the war in Ukraine. No, we didn't ask what you did. I said, what do you think about his war rule? But he says, we discussed the war in Ukraine, and I believe that he has the right point that this war should end with negotiations. I see, says the interviewer. What did you make of his rule, generally? This is what we discussed, and I very much agreed with his position. Interviewer, I'll just ask one more time. I'm curious what you think of Viktor Orban generally. I know, says Jeffrey Sachs. You can ask 100th time, but we discussed the war in Ukraine. Interviewer, okay, so you don't feel comfortable weighing in on that. You're just staring at the camera. You're not interested in talking about that. Is that accurate? Don't play games, Isaac. Let's talk about the subjects we agreed to talk about. I never agreed to only talk about any specific subjects. Are we at the end? Do you have to leave? I have to leave if we're not going to continue to try to understand more deeply how we get out of this war. Well, you said that you talked to Orban because you thought he had the right ideas about the war. More specifically, what do you think about those? What do you think those ideas are? The ideas are that we need a negotiated settlement of this war. And you think he sincerely wants that? I hope so. And then it sort of comes to an end after he talks about China for a little bit. But I thought that was fascinating. He would not be pushed on what he thinks about Orban. In other words, is he just a paid shill? Is there? This is someone who is not willing to go on the record giving his opinion on someone in a very suspicious manner, and it just casts aspersions on much of what Jeffrey Sachs is saying. I would say if there's no honesty here, then I start to get severe doubts about what he truly believes. You know, it's a bit like Scott Ritter and all these other sorts of figures who are spouting out pro-Russian narratives. You're thinking, yeah, what are you getting out of this? Oh, you used to be on a payroll for Russia Today. Okay, yeah, fair enough. So yeah, I don't know. I just thought that's a really fascinating part of the interview. I promised I'd come return to this graph, which is a graph of military equipment losses for both sides, Russia and Ukraine. And the big ones are, of course, tanks, AFVs. AFVs are armored fighting vehicles. I don't know what the difference is between AFVs and IFVs there, because I thought AFVs was the umbrella term for tanks, IFVs, and actually APCs possibly as well. But who knows? Maybe, yeah, I don't know what an AFV would be that's different from an IFV. So let's get a little bit of terminology sorted out here. So this is military-history.fandom.com wiki. Armored fighting vehicle. An armored fighting vehicle is a combat vehicle protected by strong armor and armed with weapons, which combines operational mobility, tactical, offensive, and defensive capability. So an AFV includes tank, armored car, troop carriers, amphibious vehicles, armored engineering vehicle, self-propelled artillery. So, all of these things are types of AFV. So that is indeed the modern sort of umbrella term for all of these different types of vehicle. But actually, let's go and have a look at what an IMV might be. So we have different types of troop carriers. AFVs are divided into two main types here. Yeah, APCs, armored personnel carriers, and IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles. Infantry fighting vehicle will have like some kind of weaponry on top, whereas an APC might have a tiny machine gun, but generally will just be carrying the troops. And then a sort of APC, I suppose you could say, might be an IMV, which is, if we come down here, infantry mobility vehicle or protected patrol vehicle. So perhaps this could be an MRAP, so Bushmaster IMV. So it does look. This term also applies to the vehicles currently being fielded as part of the MRAP program. So an MRAP is a mine-resistant ambush protection vehicle. In other words, it's an APC that is more heavily armored in order to resist mines and other such ordnance. So if we go back here and we look at this again, we've got tanks. I don't know that that's a false distinction. So I don't know what that column is, because our AFV should include tanks, IFV, APCs, and IMVs. In fact, it should include probably all of these, up to, well, not the engineering ones, but it arguably includes self-propelled artillery as well. But anyway, IMV is an MRAP, so that would be something like the Bushmaster, some of the Humvees, the I think the Dingo is that an IMV or MRAP, and the Hedgehog, the uh, Turkish one. I think, is it the Kirpi Hedgehog? Anyway, those are MRAPs, and it looks like Ukraine has lost more of those than Russia, and it could just be that they just have a lot more of them than Russia. Russia have a few of their, I think, the Tiger ones. In fact, we might see them in a second because they some that have been fixed up. But anyway, the that's the only type of vehicle that Ukraine have lost more of, and I assume, as I say, that's because they just have more of them than the Russians and use them more. Whereas the Russians have an awful lot of IFVs and so your BMPs, BMP 1, 2, and 3, and they have lost an absolute ton of them. So they would use BMPs rather than APCs and IMVs. So that's why there's that difference there. Okay, move. And remember, these are absolute conservative minimums. There'll be far more of these that have been lost, and these are visually confirmed. This is, you just can't really argue with these stats, and this is a pretty big indication that Russia are not doing very well in this war. Right, quickly moving on. Here we have, in fact, I'm going to go to, where is it first? Here, this one, because actually it's relevant for what we were just talking about. So here we have the Gaz Tiger in the first image of the quoted tweet is now in Ukrainian service. So what this is back in September the 14th, 2022, Ukraine Weapons Tracker listed a bunch of Russian vehicles that were lost. You've got this vehicle there. That's one we're going to look at in a second. And that's an MRAP. That's a Russian MRAP or IMV. And we have looks like is that an AP? It looks like an AP. APCs generally are wheeled. IFVs are often tracked, but it does have weaponry on top, so who knows? And that looks like a mortar, a self-propelled mortar. So rather than that be a cannon, a sort of howitzer, or a tank barrel. So self-propelled gun would have a howitzer that would fire long distance. This looks like it could be a mortar that would fire kind of up and down, very much like a mortar you'd have on the ground, but you can move it, obviously. So anyway, it's just going through a bunch of vehicles. Don't know why I did that, but this first one, now a few months later, is in service with the Ukrainians. We're given a paint job. I mean, look at that. It looks absolutely fantastic. So what I was talking about this morning, how Russia just don't have the equivalent here, which is the ability to use ARVs to recover these vehicles. Because again, this is in Ukraine. The logistics for Ukraine are very much more suited for them because it's their country, and trying to get these vehicles back to somewhere to be fixed is easier I think, for the Ukrainians than it is for the Russians in this case. And they also just have more ARVs, armor recovery vehicles, to get things like this back to somewhere like Czechia, to get them fixed up and sent back to the front line. And suddenly, so Greg was talking about how they've had a bunch of these and brand new or Western donated vehicles as well sent to Ukraine, and they're just building it up ready for their offensive. And then there's going to be pretty significant armor going on. So that's good. These are sort of technicals, I guess. These are different trucks, utes, whatever, SUVs, whatever you want to call them, with a bunch of MLRS launchers on the back. And this is a battery of them. It's incredible. You've got 3 of these at least, kicking off some albeit unguided rockets. But yeah, it's good to see that in Ukrainian hands. This is a piece of equipment that Ukrainians have in greater abundance than Russians, which is decent bulletproof vest. So the Ukrainian ballistic vest posts small arms around. What is this? Ukrainian ballistic vest post small arms round impact. So after small rounds arms impact, ceramic plate ate the projectile. Look at that there. That's obviously saved someone's life. That is a decent bit of equipment for that soldier, and that soldier gets to fight another day. Look at that. Didn't even break through to the other side of the armor. It's incredible. And that has obviously allowed that soldier to go and fight another day. And if the Russian doesn't have that equivalent, then the Russian troop gets injured or dies. Same for the Ukrainian, of course. But if the Ukrainians have far more of that kit than the Russians, then that is a meaningful competitive advantage. This is a meme, but sometimes memes are quite useful for actually proving a point, just with a bit of humor. This is how the Russians have sold their failures. This was just a tactical Russian feint, losing the entire north. This is an orderly regroup, losing Kharkiv. This is a non-existent counteroffensive. It failed multiple times, though. We just sort of retreated from there. And then losing Bakhmut and having trouble in Makiivka. Complete collapse on the front. It's like, think about how much the Russians will do a song and dance about Bakhmut if it falls. And what they're saying now, all this, you're just maximum cope, you're in cope overdrive, and all this kind of juvenile nonsense. And it's like, yeah, just you might need to rethink that. Maybe think about your own your behavior at the time that the Russians retreated from those vast areas. This is so worth watching. Unfortunately, it's so much better with music. However, I'll probably get a copyright violation if I play it. So this is Putin talking about one of the main reasons of going in to Ukraine and doing the war was to defend the Donbas. This is a Donbas before liberation. Mariupol, Donetsk. These beautiful places teeming with life. Beautiful architecture, trees, parks, culture, color in many of these places. Just wonderful. Life, all of that, all of these different places. And now these cities after Russian liberation. And actually, it is much more powerful with the music, not with me twittering on. Bakhmut, Solidar. I mean, there's some beautiful pictures of Solidar previously. Just absolute destruction. And the idea that this is liberation is insane. Just ridiculous. Anyway, yeah, so that's liberation for you. Well done for protecting the Donbas. You seem to have done that really well with incendiary munitions. And there you go. I think that was quite a stark contrast there. And indeed, protecting the Donbas, so carrying on this idea, Ukrainian Nazis have been killing the poor people of Donbas for 8 years, but Russia came to save them. This is kind of like what the Russians would say. Only an idiot could believe such BS. So you had 162 people dying in 2018. These are civilians dying in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. 105 in 2019, 70 in 2020, 44 in 2021, and 2022, 4,062. And those are the ones that they've openly admitted. It's actually going to be far more than that. I have a feeling that might just be Donetsk as well, not even Donetsk and Luhansk. But either way, I mean, it's absolutely shocking that you would think that you are going to protect the Donbas. This is Andrew Roth, who's written a very interesting article. So if you remember Makiivka, the place that was hit by HIMARS when there were 600 people gathered and up to 600 casualties, dead and wounded, maybe as many as 600 dead, but probably more likely 300 to 400. Well, they're still counting. They still have missing people, and the families are still not sure what's going on. Uh, Latest investigations have said, and I had pro-Russian voices on my threads, like spouting the Russian nonsense here, which is like, so on the day it happened, it was like, and I can name the people on the threads saying, yeah, only 15 died. You're repeating what Tass was saying, and then saying, okay, 63, and then eventually it's like, oh, 89. Oh, so you're wrong at the beginning. So when we're saying like up to 600 casualties, and you're saying only 15 dead, like, and saying that we were ridiculous for remotely believing that it could be more than that, but then the Russians begrudgingly accepted it was more than that, and in fact now they've stopped reporting on it because they don't want the information to be used as propaganda against them. But they've done some investigation to show at least 130 have died, as in that's who they can find the details of, and by speaking to relatives and things. But there are still like loads missing. As both of the soldiers whose relatives I spoke to for the Samara dispatch have just been found, but I've seen new soldiers listed as missing too. And by found, I think that means killed. So as in found dead. So that's a very interesting Guardian article. It's a disgrace not to go to war. Muted Russian protests against Ukraine conflict. Families of dead Russian soldiers appear even more supportive of military operation. That's how cognitive dissonance works. It's just insane how you would think that that's your way of justifying. Because at the end of the day, if you're a parent, if you're parents of someone who's died in this war, you either get so unbelievably angry that you have to blame the government, and that's really dangerous. But also, it means that your son died in for an utterly pointless cause, or you say your son died a hero, and you support the war even more. And that latter one, as kind of irrational as that might be, given all the evidence that we have, is the one that's probably psychologically more preferable for the parent. So yeah. And just and that's that. What an anticlimax. Story of my life. So thank you very much for being a part of this. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, subscribe, and share. I really appreciate all of your support. You are fabulous, fabulous people. I'm honoured to have such great conversations down in the threads, and for you guys to choose. So many people have said, you've become part of my life. You're part of my daily routine. I'm deeply honoured, because I'm not going to get emotional here. It's just random. This is just me on the internet talking about stuff that I really love talking about, and just hoping that other people like listening to this, or like to be interested in the same things I am. And it turns out quite a lot of people are, and that's kind of weird. So thanks, guys. Thanks for being equally weird. Anyway, take care. I'll speak to you tomorrow.